On a warm spring evening in May of 1940, two men sat across from each other in a quiet Berlin restaurant, one wearing the uniform of the German army, the other representing a nation Germany was hours away from invading. Between them lay a secret that could alter the fate of millions. By the time their plates were cleared, the final order for the assault on the Low Countries had already been signed. And somewhere in the darkness outside, 2 million soldiers were waiting for dawn. This is episode 11 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. In our last episode, we watched Norway fall under the weight of boldness, blunders, and a political earthquake that reshaped Britain's leadership. Tonight, we move into the moment the war in the West truly ignites. As the evening settles around you, we'll follow a desperate warning whispered in Berlin, the thunder of engines over Holland and Belgium, paratroopers drifting down onto bridges and airfields, and the rising fear of a fifth column that turned rumour into paralysis. It is a story of courage, confusion, deception, and a small nation fighting for time that would never come. I've shaped this narrative with care so it can accurately inform you while letting the weight of the day slowly fall away. If these episodes bring you comfort, a like and a subscription help more than you know. And if you feel like it, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Those messages mean a great deal. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. The spring of 1940 had come to Europe with a gentleness that seemed in memory almost out of place. After an unusually harsh winter, months during which frost had pressed down upon the continent with a cold that felt final, something had relented in the world. The days grew longer in gradual increments, and the evenings began to carry a warmth that invited people back outdoors, back toward the small rituals of ordinary life. Trees put out their first pale leaves and then darkened slowly toward full summer green. The light fell at different angles now, catching the stone of cities and the still surfaces of rivers in ways that belonged to a different kind of time. In Berlin, as in every capital that stood in the path of what was gathering, people noticed it. The birdsong, the softness in the air, the sense that the world was renewing itself regardless of what men were planning. By all accounts, by the memory of everyone who lived through those weeks, this had been one of the loveliest springs that anyone could remember. On the evening of May the 9th, somewhere within that gentle city, two men met in secret and shared what would be their last meal together. One of them was Colonel Jacob Saas, the military attaché assigned to the Dutch legation in Berlin, a careful, measured man who had learned how to move through the German capital with professional discretion. The other was Hans Oster, a senior officer within the Abwehr, which was Germany's military intelligence service, and a man whose deepest convictions stood in silent, constant opposition to the state whose uniform he wore. Oster was, in every meaningful sense, an anti-Nazi, a figure of moral seriousness who had decided at considerable personal risk that conscience required action. Across the months preceding that evening, the two men had met quietly and with great care. In each of those meetings, Oster had passed to his Dutch friend some portion of what he knew, the plans being drawn up at the highest levels of German military thinking, the timetables and intentions that no foreign officer should ever have possessed. It was an extraordinary arrangement, sustained by an extraordinary trust, and by the shared understanding that something catastrophic was being prepared and that a warning, however imperfect, was worth the danger of delivering it. That evening, over the last dinner they would share, Oster spoke plainly about what had been decided. The German offensive against the Low Countries and France, designated in the precise, impersonal language of military planning as Fall Gelb or Case Yellow, was confirmed to begin at 5 o'clock the following morning. The final order, Oster explained with quiet certainty, would be issued at 9:30 that night. If nothing came through to countermand it in the hours that followed, the invasion would proceed. When the meal was finished, the two men stepped together into the blacked-out streets of the capital. Berlin at night during wartime was a particular kind of place, a great city moving carefully through enforced darkness, its grand avenues stripped of their ordinary illumination, familiar shapes dissolved into shadow. They walked together through those quiet streets toward the headquarters of the German High Command, and there, outside on the Bendlerstrasse, Colonel Sass stopped and waited while Oster went inside. It is difficult to know what passes through a man's mind in such a moment, standing in a darkened street in a city preparing for war, waiting for a word that will confirm or forestall the end of everything his country has been building against. The minutes passed with the particular slowness of anticipated crisis. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Oster came hurrying out from the building. His words were brief, without preamble. There had been no cancellation. The invasion was to begin. Sass turned and moved quickly back through the darkened streets toward the Dutch legation, something close to a sprint, though trained soldiers do not always show urgency that way. Within minutes he was at the telephone, connected through to the Ministry of War in The Hague. He kept his words deliberate and economical, as a man will when he understands that a message must travel clearly across a wire in the small hours of the night and arrive exactly as it was sent. He had only one thing to tell them, he said. Tomorrow at dawn. Hold firm. Had they understood? He asked them to repeat it back. They had understood. Along the telephone wires, the warning spread outward from that moment with the urgency the hour demanded. Dutch political and military leaders were suddenly and fully awake to the enormity of what was coming with the dawn. Orders went immediately to troops stationed across the country. Defense plans that had been rehearsed and held in readiness through months of anxious preparation were set into motion with desperate speed. And through the lines connecting the Netherlands to its allies, the first calls for assistance were already travelling, voices pressing through the wires in the deep of the night, carrying all the warning the darkness had allowed. The spring evening lay softly over the continent, indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere beyond the quiet city, somewhere past the warm memory of that last supper shared in secret, 2 million men were already waiting for morning. Dawn arrived as it always does, quietly, without announcement, the sky above the continent shifting through its familiar gradations of darkness into grey, grey into pale gold. On the morning of May the 10th, 1940, the light came as it had on 1,000 mornings before it across the fields and rivers of northwestern Europe. And then, before the last stars had fully faded, the sound began. It came first as a low and distant texture in the air, something felt as much as heard, a vibration pressing gently against the chest, against the stillness. Then it grew. Within moments, the horizon to the east was alive with movement. Hundreds of aircraft swept in across the Allied air bases and communication centres in the north of France, arriving not with the scattered randomness of a weather event, but with the precise and terrible organisation of something that had been rehearsed, and rehearsed again through the long winter months of preparation. At that same moment, simultaneously as if the whole vast operation were governed by a single heartbeat, an enormous force of armour and infantry broke across the borders of 3 nations at once. Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg were struck together in the pre-dawn darkness, the weight of 2 million men beginning to move with the slow, irresistible momentum of something geological. Tanks led the way, their engines carrying a sound through the morning air that had never been heard in quite that density before. Behind them came the infantry, division upon division, a force so large that the roads and tracks and open ground seemed barely adequate to contain it. What made the opening hours of Fall Gelb so disorienting, for those who experienced it on the receiving end, was the sheer simultaneity of it all. There was no single point of crisis to turn toward, no obvious place where resistance might gather and hold. The strikes were everywhere, arriving from multiple directions and at multiple altitudes, filling the radios with fragmented, overlapping reports that resisted any coherent picture. Commanders who had spent years preparing for war found that the war arriving bore only the faintest resemblance to the one they had imagined. The German 18th Army had been assigned the task of overrunning Holland, a force whose composition reflected the ambition of the operation it had been designed to accomplish. Within it moved an armoured division, an airborne division carried in transport aircraft, a cavalry division, a motorized SS infantry division, and 6 standard infantry divisions. 1 additional division, 12,000 men specially trained for air landings, had been prepared for precisely this kind of assault. Alongside all of these, approximately 4,000 paratroopers, organized into 2 regiments, had been loaded into aircraft and were now descending on the Netherlands from above. The paratroopers materialized over Dutch soil as if conjured from the morning itself, floating down from aircraft onto airfields and the great bridges that spanned the country's wide rivers and estuaries. 4 separate groups descended toward the highway and railway bridges at Moerdijk, Dordrecht and Rotterdam, bridges whose capture would determine whether the Dutch interior could be held or must be surrendered. A 5th unit turned toward The Hague, the Dutch capital, its objectives reaching toward the political heart of the nation. From above and below, from the frontier and from the sky, the attack pressed inward from every edge at once. The scale of it defied the ordinary logic of military crisis, where a commander identifies a breach and moves to seal it. Here there were breaches everywhere, or what felt like everywhere, and the available forces could address only so many of them before the morning had already shifted the map beyond recognition. In the hours that followed, somewhere in the gathering noise and confusion of those first engagements, something larger than any individual battle was already being decided. Borders that had held through years of anxious neutrality were dissolving in the morning light. Families in Dutch farmhouses heard the aircraft and came to their doorways, uncertain of what to do with what they were seeing. Soldiers at frontier posts who had maintained their positions through months of waiting, now found themselves in contact with an enemy that had arrived with more force, more speed, and more coordination than almost any prior imagination of war had included. The battle that would determine the fate of the West had begun, not with a declaration, not with a final ultimatum, but with the sound of engines in the dawn sky and the ground beginning to shake beneath the weight of what was coming. The force assembled to subdue Holland was, by any measure of military planning, a precisely engineered instrument. At its core was the German 18th Army, a combined arms formation whose various components had been fitted together with the particular logic of the campaign it was meant to accomplish. An armored division provided the weight and speed of mechanized assault. An airborne division, transported in aircraft and deployed in waves, carried the operation into dimensions of territory that conventional ground forces could never have reached by road or rail alone. A cavalry division, a motorized SS infantry division, and 6 additional standard infantry divisions completed the picture of overwhelming mass. Beyond all of these, one division had been set apart from the beginning, 12,000 men selected and prepared specifically for the demands of aerial landing, their training designed around the extraordinary task of arriving by air and seizing ground before a defender could understand what was happening. War at this stage was beginning to move through dimensions it had never occupied before, and these men represented one of its newest and strangest expressions. Separate from the army's ground formations, 2 full regiments of paratroopers, approximately 4,000 men, had been loaded into aircraft and dispatched across the Dutch frontier from above. Their targets were among the most strategically significant pieces of ground in the Netherlands, the great bridges at Moerdijk, Dordrecht and Rotterdam, where road and rail lines crossed the wide waterways that divided the Dutch interior. 4 separate groups descended toward these crossings, each assigned its objectives, each aware that the bridges had to be taken and held intact if the armored columns pressing in from the east were to advance without catastrophic delay. A 5th paratroop unit turned its attention toward the Hague itself, the seat of Dutch government, the place where the country's political and military leadership gathered and made its decisions. The intention was to strike simultaneously at the infrastructure of movement and the infrastructure of authority, disabling both before either could respond effectively to what was descending upon them. What the Dutch had prepared against was, in its broad outline, something not entirely unlike this. Their military planners had long assumed that an attack would come along 2 axes at once, armored forces pressing hard against the eastern frontier, and airborne troops dropped deep into the interior to seize territory and sow confusion behind the main defensive lines. The army's defensive doctrine had been built around these twin threats, and it contained a response to each. Against the paratroopers and airborne troops, the Dutch intended to move quickly, to identify where the drops had occurred, encircle the isolated units before they could be reinforced or resupplied, and neutralize them before their presence behind the lines could do decisive damage. Against the armored thrust from the east, the strategy was one of deliberate, measured retreat, destroying bridges as the army withdrew, releasing water across low-lying farmland to flood the approaches, making the advancing columns slow their pace and stretch their supply lines across increasingly difficult terrain. Every river crossing that could be denied to the enemy, every road that could be submerged or blocked, bought more time for what the Dutch were ultimately relying upon. That ultimate refuge was a concept their planners called Fortress Holland, a densely populated stretch of coastal territory lying between Rotterdam in the south and Amsterdam in the north, crisscrossed with waterways, enclosed by geography, and difficult to assault across open water. If the Dutch army could draw the line there, if the flooding and the demolitions could slow the German advance long enough, the defenders might find themselves in a position that had some historical precedent, a fortified interior bounded by water where a smaller force could hold out against a far larger one and wait for help to arrive. It was a strategy built on patience and on the reasonable assumption that geography, properly used, could compensate for what the army lacked in size and equipment. The defenders could settle down for a siege, or so the plan had always imagined, and in that siege perhaps something might yet be salvaged. How a plan looks on the eve of battle and how it endures contact with the actual enemy are two entirely different things. The Dutch had prepared carefully and soberly for a war they had hoped would never come. Their assumptions were reasonable. Their dispositions were considered. And the morning of May the 10th was already reshaping every one of them. The Dutch defensive plan had assumed at its foundation that time would be available. Time to receive the warning, time to call units to their positions, time to place the demolition charges and trigger them at the right moment as the enemy approached. The plan was logical. It was built on reasonable military assumptions about how quickly events could move. And in the first hours of May the 10th, it began to unravel in ways that no amount of careful planning could have fully anticipated. Along the Issel River, Dutch engineers managed to destroy the crossings before the advancing columns could reach them. Some of the bridges over the Maas also came down. These were real successes, acts of discipline and speed under pressure that the defenders could take some measure of quiet pride in. The demolitions denied the enemy ground that would otherwise have been given up without cost. But the morning was moving faster than any timetable could accommodate. Before the Dutch forces had done more than secure those first crossings, the Germans were already among them. Paratroopers descended onto Dutch bridge positions with a speed that compressed the defenders' reaction time to almost nothing. Bridge guards who had stood at their posts through long, uneventful months of quiet tension suddenly found themselves in direct contact with men dropping from the sky above them. Men who were trained, purposeful, and in many cases better prepared for this specific moment than those tasked with holding against them. The guards were overpowered, and where the paratroopers had landed and secured a foothold, the aircraft came in again, wave after wave of transport planes depositing additional troops alongside the bridgeheads, some units even arriving by seaplane, setting down on the rivers themselves and moving from the water's surface directly into the fighting. The armor, meanwhile, was grinding forward from the eastern frontier with the steady momentum of something that had been in motion since before dawn. As the paratroopers held the captured crossings against Dutch counterattacks, the panzer columns approached along the roads from the border, closing the distance between the frontier and the bridges that had been taken and held for exactly this purpose. The plan was functioning as designed, and in the places where it functioned best, the Dutch found themselves unable to break the equation. Among the most carefully prepared of these operations was the seizure of the Gennep Bridge over the Maas, and what happened there carried a particular kind of chill, because the enemy arrived in the clothing of friends. 3 men approached the Dutch guard post at Gennep wearing Dutch military uniforms. 2 of them were Dutch nationals who had aligned themselves with the Nazi movement. The third was German. Together they presented themselves as soldiers returning, or reporting, or doing whatever a small group of uniformed men might plausibly be doing at a crossing in the hours before dawn, on a morning that had already announced itself as something extraordinary. The guards at the post were taken entirely by surprise and overwhelmed before any alarm could be raised. These 3 men then cleared the approach for 11 more soldiers, all similarly dressed in Dutch uniforms, who moved quickly across the position and secured the bridge. For a short time, a handful of impostors held one of the most strategically vital crossings in the southern Netherlands against a country that was only beginning to understand what was happening to it. They held it long enough. The German 265th Infantry Regiment arrived, first in an armoured car, then in a freight train, and began crossing the Maas while the bridge remained intact. The soldiers unloaded their equipment approximately 10 miles beyond the crossing, well inside Dutch-held territory, and immediately turned their attention toward the defensive positions that lay ahead of them. Positions that had been designed to face an enemy arriving from the east were suddenly threatened from a direction that planning had assumed would remain protected. The rear in the early hours of the battle for Holland was becoming as uncertain as the front. There is something quietly devastating about deception of this kind, the way it exploits not aggression but familiarity, the trust that a uniform carries, the moment of hesitation before a soldier at a remote post allows himself to believe that something is wrong. In those moments, history sometimes hinges on instincts that no training can fully prepare a person for. The bridges that were supposed to buy time had become the means by which time ran out. The largest concentration of airborne troops dispatched against Holland that morning was directed toward the Hague, the seat of government, the center of the country's political life, and the place where, if things went according to German planning, the war for the Netherlands could be effectively ended in a single morning. The objectives were layered and interdependent. First, the airports surrounding the capital would be seized and held open, giving transport aircraft a place to land reinforcements and denying the Allies any possibility of delivering their own airborne support. Then, once the airfields were secure, detachments of soldiers would move into the city itself, riding motorcycles through the streets in the gathering daylight to locate and capture Queen Wilhelmina and the members of the Dutch government. If the leadership could be taken, the argument went, resistance would lose its center and the nation's will to fight might follow. It was an audacious plan, and in its opening phase it appeared to be working. The airports near The Hague were seized in the first hours of the assault, the paratroopers consolidating their hold on the runways and perimeter positions with the speed and coordination their training had prepared them for. Then the Dutch I Corps counterattacked, moving with a decisiveness that the morning's chaos had done little to diminish. Dutch ground forces struck back at the captured airfields with enough force to drive the German airborne troops off the runways entirely. Roughly 1,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in the fighting around The Hague, a significant number, and a reversal that left the original plan for capturing the royal family and government in ruins. The Queen, for the time being, remained beyond reach. The capital, for the time being, held, The German units that survived the counterattack withdrew to defensive positions in the villages surrounding the city, where they dug in and resisted every effort to dislodge them. They could no longer accomplish their primary mission. They could, however, occupy the attention of Dutch forces that were desperately needed elsewhere, and in that secondary capacity the stranded paratroopers around the Hague continued to exert a weight on the battle that their diminished numbers alone could not explain. It was in the atmosphere surrounding these events, in the gap between what was actually happening and what people believed was happening, that something perhaps equally damaging began to take hold. Rumors spread through the city and outward into the countryside with a speed that outpaced every military communication. The paratroopers, it was said, had not arrived in uniform. They had come disguised as police officers, as traveling salesmen, as farm laborers moving through the fields, as priests and nuns making their quiet way along country roads. The implication, once it had settled into the collective imagination, was deeply corrosive. If the enemy wore the clothes of ordinary life, then ordinary life itself became a theatre of suspicion. In the towns and villages surrounding The Hague, soldiers who should have been deployed to the fighting front were instead redirected into cities to conduct searches, moving through streets and buildings looking for infiltrators who, in the vast majority of cases, were simply not there. The fear that a neighbor or a stranger might be an enemy in disguise consumed hours and manpower that the Dutch military could not spare. Reports of parachutists continued to arrive from increasingly improbable locations, each one feeding the next, each one expanding the geography of dread. Ordinary perception began to fail under the weight of it. Traffic being directed around an obstacle became misdirection by an imposter. A well that tasted slightly different from usual carried the shadow of poisoning. A rumor whispered at a crossroads arrived 3 villages later as established fact. The confusion generated by the real attack, which was genuine, large and serious enough on its own terms, became entangled with the confusion generated by fear of an imaginary one, and the combination produced something closer to paralysis than panic. There was, in all of this, at least one moment that carried a note of dark and unintended comedy. German paratroopers who had landed in proper military uniform, men who were, whatever else they represented, clearly soldiers engaged in a conventional military operation, found themselves in some instances nearly attacked by Dutch civilians who were too furious to be frightened of them. The housewives of Holland, it turned out, had a considerably lower threshold for outrage than for terror, and the paratroopers in their midst discovered that the rumored disguises had, in a roundabout way, made even the uniformed and undisguised among them targets of a different kind of wrath entirely. The chaos of that morning wore many faces. Some were grim. Some, in the particular way of history, were almost absurd. Despite everything, the bridges seized before they could be blown, the paratroopers descending from a clear morning sky, the armor pressing steadily inward from the frontier, Fortress Holland had not yet fallen. In the hours following the initial assault, the core of Dutch resistance remained intact. German troops had captured the great bridges leading into Rotterdam, but Dutch defenders had moved with enough speed and resolve to seal off the northern ends of those bridgeheads, forming a barrier that held the enemy's armor on the far side of the water. The tanks could cross the bridges in theory. In practice, they could not deploy. The perimeter held. And as long as the perimeter held, there remained the possibility, slender, uncertain, but real, that Allied reinforcements might yet arrive in sufficient strength and in sufficient time to alter what was happening. The Dutch fought on through those first terrible days with that possibility in mind. They waited, and they held what they could hold, and they hoped. What they could not have known, what perhaps no one outside a handful of Allied planning rooms fully understood in those early hours, was that the plans their allies had drawn up for meeting the German assault had never included a major effort to relieve Holland. The Allied strategy for responding to an attack on the Low Countries and France had been conceived around a different geography entirely, built around the expectation of where the decisive fighting would occur and where the available forces could be most effectively committed. The plan called for the French First Army to advance through Belgium toward the Dyle and Meuse rivers as soon as the attack began. Units of the British Expeditionary Force operating under General Lord Gort would move rapidly to cover Brussels while the Belgians held Antwerp, Ghent, and the Albert Canal. A modest French force would keep watch on the Ardennes in the south, while the great mass of the French army, 43 divisions, remained anchored to the Maginot Line, the heavily fortified defensive works that stretched along France's eastern frontier. In this architecture of response, only a single army had been assigned a role that touched Dutch soil. The French 7th Army, commanded by General Henri Giraud, was to advance northward along the Channel coast and reach the region around Breda in the southern Netherlands, close enough to join with Dutch forces and seal the gap that would otherwise open between Antwerp and the sea. It was a reasonable allocation, given the assumptions that underlay it. The Allies had distributed their forces according to their best understanding of where the weight of the German attack would fall and where the ground could best be defended. Holland was a consideration, but a secondary one, its relief dependent on Giraud's army moving quickly enough and far enough to make contact before the situation there deteriorated beyond recovery. The assumptions, as it turned out, were precisely what the German plan had been designed to exploit. But in those first hours, as Dutch defenders sealed their bridgeheads and the paralysis of uncertainty had not yet fully descended over Allied headquarters, none of that was yet visible. The framework of the Allied response had been set in motion. Armies were advancing. The coordination that planners had spent months preparing was beginning to unfold. Whether it would unfold fast enough, whether Giraud's columns could reach Breda before the bridges were lost and the road north closed, whether the fragile perimeter around Rotterdam could hold long enough for any of it to matter, these were questions that the morning had asked and that only the coming days would answer. For the Dutch soldiers holding the northern edges of the captured bridgeheads, and for the civilians who moved through those first days in the particular suspended tension of people who understand that something enormous is happening but cannot yet see its shape, the waiting had a quality all its own. It was not passive. It was the active, exhausting effort of people holding a line while looking over their shoulders toward the south and west, toward the direction from which, if the plans held and the armies moved and the timing proved right, help would eventually come. The gap between Antwerp and the Channel remained the pivot on which everything turned, and it was toward that gap, along the flat coastal roads of a country just beginning to register the weight of what had arrived, that the French 7th Army was moving to close it. The road into Belgium from the east had been travelled by German armies before. In the summer of 1914, a generation earlier, those same flat approaches had carried the opening movements of a different war, and the memory of that passage had shaped everything that Belgium had done in the decades since to make certain it would never happen so easily again. Along the northern approaches to Liège, where the Albert Canal met the Meuse River, the Belgians had constructed a fortress that represented the most sophisticated thinking of the age about how fixed defenses should be built and how they should function. Fort Eben-Emael was not simply a strong point. It was an engineering argument, a massive layered structure of earth and reinforced concrete housing a garrison of 1,500 men and an array of electrically operated artillery that had been positioned with extraordinary care. 2 120mm guns and 16 75mm guns were set into well-camouflaged, heavily armoured apertures, each sighted to cover approaches from specific directions and overlapping fields of fire that left almost no angle of attack unaddressed. The garrison had been placed on alert on the night of May the 9th. They checked their equipment, confirmed their positions, and waited in the particular confidence of men who understood themselves to be sheltered within something very nearly impregnable. The fortress had been designed to defeat enemies arriving by land from any direction. At 4:30 on the morning of May the 10th, 42 Junkers transport aircraft lifted from an airfield at Cologne and turned westward, each one towing a glider loaded with a team of specially trained assault troops and their equipment. The aircraft climbed to altitude, crossed the frontier in the darkness, and at 5 minutes before dawn, precisely timed to coincide with the opening of the main offensive, the gliders were released. They came in silently, engines absent, their approach carrying none of the auditory warning that powered aircraft would have provided. 42 craft descended through the early morning air toward the gateway to the Belgian plain. 9 of those gliders aimed directly for the roof of Eben-Emael itself. A force of 80 men, led by a sergeant, came sliding down onto the top of the fortress and leaped from their craft into the pale morning light. What followed was something that the garrison below, for all their preparation, had never been asked to prepare against. The assault teams moved across the roof with rehearsed precision, pressing explosive charges into gun slits, ventilators, and every opening they could locate in the concrete surface above the underground galleries. For the armoured gun turrets, they carried a device of an altogether different order, a hollow charge demolition weapon, whose design had been proposed by Hitler himself, and whose effect was unlike anything previously used in warfare at this scale. The charge, when detonated against steel or reinforced concrete, drove a concentrated jet of superheated force through the material in a fraction of a second, punching through armor that conventional explosives would merely have scarred, igniting everything within, killing the gun crews, destroying the weapons, and filling the tunnels below with dense, choking smoke. Flamethrowers followed, discharged into the gun ports, thickening the fires already burning in the interior and adding their heat to the acrid atmosphere spreading through the fort's lower levels. Within an hour of dawn, the great artillery of Eben-Emael had been effectively silenced. The garrison fought on with whatever means remained, and this endurance, sustained under extraordinary conditions, deserves to be remembered with something more than a footnote. They held out through the morning and into the following day, a battered and increasingly isolated force maintaining resistance against opponents who controlled the roof above them. At noon on May the 11th, surrounded by German ground troops and hammered repeatedly by Stuka attacks from above, the 1,500 defenders of Fort Eben Emael laid down their arms. The remaining gliders had meanwhile descended onto the western bank of the Albert Canal. Approximately 300 assault troops swarmed across 3 of the canal's main bridges almost simultaneously. Belgian engineers managed to detonate the charges on one of the 3 crossings before they could be overrun, and that bridge came down. The other 2 were taken intact, their demolition charges either cut or neutralized in the chaos of contact, and the German troops who seized them held on through the counterattacks that followed. Transport aircraft returned and dropped reinforcements by parachute. 500 men, a small number given the scale of what surrounded them. To make that number feel larger and to deepen the confusion already spreading through Belgian defensive positions, General Kurt Student, commanding Germany's paratroop forces, had ordered dummy parachutists equipped with explosive charges to be dropped alongside the real ones. They descended, drifted, and detonated on landing with dramatic effect, their explosions suggesting a drop far more numerous than the actual figures warranted. Behind all of this, moving through the breach that the glider troops and paratroopers had opened, came the panzers and infantry of General Fedor von Bock's Army Group B, rolling westward across the Albert Canal and fanning out across the Belgian plain beyond, following in the wake of men who had fallen from the sky to unlock a door that was supposed to hold for weeks. To meet this expected thrust, the Allied units in northern France began their advance, moving northward and eastward into Belgium in long columns, taking their assigned positions beside the Belgian army along the Dyle and Meuse rivers, with a coordination that, in those early hours, appeared to be proceeding exactly as intended. 22 French and British divisions marched forward on schedule, filling the gaps between 15 Belgian divisions arrayed across the front covering Brussels and Antwerp. The towns they passed through received them with the warmth that liberated or defended people sometimes find for soldiers arriving in their streets. Belgian civilians lining the roads, throwing flowers, calling out encouragement as the columns moved through. The soldiers marching northward had reason to feel, in those early hours, that they were part of something coherent and purposeful. Their opening engagements with the forces of General Fedor von Bock's Army Group B in the north of Belgium went reasonably well. The line held. Ground was contested and kept. Among the officers watching these movements with something more than professional interest, there were those who felt an unease that the early results did little to settle. The advance was going smoothly, almost too smoothly. The enemy, who had demonstrated over the preceding months a remarkable capacity for doing the unexpected, seemed in the north to be doing precisely what he had been expected to do, pressing hard along the wide, level approaches into Belgium that German armies had historically favored. Was it possible, some wondered quietly, that 22 divisions were walking northward into a situation that had been arranged for them? The question was reasonable. The answer, already being shaped by events elsewhere, was one that those divisions would not receive in time. Indeed, the Allies were completely unaware that a German death blow was gathering momentum through the Ardennes. While the Allied armies moved northward into Belgium with their flags and their confidence, a different kind of war was already underway. one that no Allied general had yet fully perceived, and that the landscape itself seemed designed to conceal. The Ardennes is ancient terrain. Its ridges fold into one another across the southern reaches of Belgium in long, heavily wooded waves, cut through with narrow valleys and roads that twist between the trees with little regard for military convenience. French military thinking had looked at this geography and drawn what seemed, on the surface, a sensible conclusion: that no serious armoured thrust could be sustained through such terrain in any reasonable time frame. The roads were too narrow, the gradients too severe, the forest too dense. It would take an advancing force somewhere between 9 and 10 days to negotiate that ground and arrive at the Meuse River on the far side, and that was time enough, the thinking ran, to read the situation clearly and respond. On the basis of this reasoning, the forces assigned to the Ardennes sector had been kept deliberately thin. Light motorized units watched the approaches. The Meuse line itself was held by the 2nd and 9th Armies, formations that were, compared to the divisions moving north toward Belgium, more poorly trained and less well equipped, considered adequate for a sector where nothing decisive was expected to occur. The plan now moving through that forest had been conceived by General Erich von Manstein and entrusted to General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A, a formation whose composition represented an extraordinary concentration of German striking power. 7 armoured divisions had been fed into the Ardennes during the night of May the 9th and 10th, negotiating the minefields near the Belgian-German frontier in darkness and pushing the light French and Belgian forces back with a steadiness that left little room for the defenders to establish any coherent resistance. The roads through the forest were indeed narrow. The columns stretched back for extraordinary distances, and still they moved. By May the 12th, 2 days into the offensive, all 7 armoured divisions had reached the Meuse near Sedan. What French planners had estimated would require 9 or 10 days had taken 2. Far to the south, in the wooded ridges and deep ravines of the Ardennes region of southern Belgium, the true weight of the German offensive had been placed precisely where the French believed it was least likely to fall. The armoured thrust through the Ardennes was the real stroke. The advance in the north, von Bock's armies pushing into Belgium, drawing the Allied divisions forward with their flowers and their cheering crowds, was the gesture designed to make the real stroke invisible for as long as possible. Hitler watched the Allied advance northward into Belgium with an intensity that those around him found almost electric. As the reports came in, division after division moving to take position along the Dial and the Meuse, the entire Allied force in the north committing itself to the battle that von Bock's armies were inviting, he described his reaction to associates afterward with a directness that carried the particular satisfaction of a man who has staked everything on a single reading of an opponent's mind and been proven correct. When the news arrived confirming that the Allied armies were moving forward across the whole front, he said, he could have wept for joy. They had believed it. They had believed that the old approach was being repeated, the wide-wheeling movement through Belgium that German doctrine had favoured in an earlier war, and they had moved to meet it exactly as the plan required them to. The great columns of French and British soldiers marching northward through towns hung with welcome and goodwill were, in the cold geography of what was actually unfolding, moving away from the place where the battle would be decided. They had fallen into the trap. The Meuse at Sedan is a swift, narrow river, running between steep banks with high ground rising on the French side. It was, by any conventional assessment, a strong defensive position, the kind of terrain feature that military doctrine recognized as genuinely valuable. The French had prepared it accordingly. Dugouts lined the near bank. Hundreds of artillery positions had been constructed on the heights above, sited to pour fire down onto any force attempting a crossing. Though German intelligence had been thorough enough to locate the position of nearly every French gun along that stretch of river, the line still presented itself as something formidable, something that would require time and cost to overcome. What changed everything was the sky. From early morning on May the 13th, German aircraft arrived over the Meuse in a sustained and coordinated effort unlike anything the defenders on those heights had yet experienced. Stukas came screaming down in their characteristic dives, pulling out low over the water with a sound specifically designed to penetrate and unsettle, a mechanical shriek that mixed with the concussion of explosives into something that was as much a psychological instrument as a physical one. Low-level bombers followed in small groups almost continuously, giving the French gun crews no interval long enough to recover, to reorganize, to steady themselves and bring accurate fire to bear on the forces gathering below. Hour after hour it continued. The rhythm of it wore through the resistance of the men on those heights, with a patience that daylight bombardment had rarely been able to sustain before. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the French artillery covering the river had been pressed into silence, its crews driven from their positions, the guns themselves in many cases damaged or destroyed. The coordinated fire that might have made a crossing catastrophically costly reduced to something scattered and intermittent. Into that silence, the Germans came down to the water. Assault boats were carried to the bank and launched. Inflatable dinghies followed. Soldiers crossed the Meuse under whatever fire remained, reaching the western bank and spreading out to secure the ground they had taken. Behind them, engineers began the work of constructing pontoon bridges across the current, temporary structures that would carry the weight of armor once the infantry had established enough of a perimeter to make the crossing survivable. Beachheads formed on the far bank, small at first, then broader, anchored against the counterattacks that the French would launch, and that would, in the hours ahead, arrive too late and with too little coordination to dislodge what had already taken root. The Meuse had been crossed. The line that French planning had placed its final confidence in had been breached on the very day it was tested, and on the western bank of the river, in ground that had been French and safe and certain that morning, something was beginning to expand that would, within days, reshape the entire war. General Heinz Guderian crossed the Meuse in an assault boat sometime after the engineers had finished their first pontoon bridges, moving from the eastern bank to the western with the deliberate calm of a commander who needed to see the ground his troops were holding and assess what came next. What he found on the far bank was not the tense, grimly focused atmosphere of men clinging to a contested beachhead by their fingernails. He found something that surprised even him, a mood among his forward troops that he could only describe afterward as almost carefree. Near the river's edge, he located the commander of the 1st Rifle Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Balk, and his staff. Balk greeted his general with a cheerful remark about pleasure boating on the Meuse being forbidden. a phrase that Guderian himself had coined during the months of training that had preceded the operation, directed at younger officers whose attitude toward the crossing had struck him as insufficiently serious. Standing on the western bank of the river he had just crossed under fire, Guderian recognized, with something approaching quiet amusement, that those younger officers had perhaps understood the situation more accurately than he had given them credit for. The French response to the crossing came with a determination that deserved better results than it achieved. Counterattacks were mounted with genuine urgency, and some of the heights along the riverbank changed hands 3 or 4 times as French and German forces pressed against each other across the same narrow ground. But the counterattacks arrived late and without the coordination that might have made them decisive. French armor was committed in mass against the expanding bridgeheads, a significant force committed at real cost, and it ran into the hard reality of the material and tactical gap that had opened between the two armies. French tanks were slower than their German counterparts, their operational range was shorter, and they lacked the radio communications that allowed German armored units to adapt and redirect themselves in real time during the fluid chaos of armored combat. More than 50 French tanks were destroyed by German panzers within the space of a few hours. From the air, the Allied effort to disrupt the German positions along the Meuse and the growing pontoon bridges proved even more costly. The Royal Air Force committed what aircraft it could spare to the effort, sending them in against a crossing that was protected by a dense concentration of anti-aircraft guns. The losses were severe in a way that bent the trajectory of the entire air campaign. Of the 474 aircraft the RAF had been able to allocate to operations over France, 268 were lost by May the 14th. More than half. Gone in days. Once the armor crossed in strength and began moving westward, the character of what was happening shifted from a battle into something that had fewer historical precedents. General Erwin Rommel had brought his 7th Panzer Division across the Meuse at a point upstream from Guderian's corps, and his columns were now driving into the French rear with a speed that dissolved the ordinary geography of front and back, safe and dangerous, known and unknown. The countryside through which his tanks moved had been, days earlier, territory that French soldiers and French civilians understood as interior as behind the war, removed from its immediate violence. Rommel described what his advance encountered along those roads with a directness that carried its own weight. Civilians and soldiers alike lay pressed into ditches and against hedgerows, their faces marked by something beyond ordinary fear. French military columns and civilian refugee convoys had become intertwined on the roads. Artillery pieces, tanks, military transport, and horse-drawn carts all tangled together in movement that had lost its direction and its purpose. The image he recorded was of people in flight along both sides of every road. Military discipline dissolved into the same current of movement that was carrying farm women and their children and whatever they had managed to load onto wagons before leaving. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding the 4th Armored Division, was moving to strike at the southern flank of Guderian's rapidly expanding corridor when he encountered something that no amount of professional training had prepared him to absorb. Along the roads ahead of his advance, moving in the opposite direction, came droves of French soldiers, disarmed without formation, shuffling southward with the dispersed, directionless quality of men who had ceased to be an army and had become simply individuals in motion away from something overwhelming. They had been overrun by the panzers, and the German tank crews pressing forward with the momentum of forces that had no time to spare for the ordinary administration of prisoners had shouted to them from their moving vehicles with a contempt that carried its own particular chill, telling them to drop their weapons and clear the road because there was no time to take them prisoner. Rotterdam had held when almost everything else had given way. While the Dutch defensive line across the rest of the country had been compressed and broken and bypassed, the city on the Maas had maintained something that the first days of the invasion had taken from nearly every other position the Dutch had tried to defend. German armoured forces had arrived at its southern approaches and found themselves unable to advance further. The paratroopers who had seized the bridges leading into the city held their ground, but the Dutch defenders had sealed the bridgeheads at the northern ends with a tenacity that kept the enemy's tanks from crossing and deploying into the city itself. The stalemate was imperfect and precarious, surrounded on all sides by a campaign that was going catastrophically wrong for the Netherlands. But it was real. Rotterdam was still holding. Hitler had little patience for imperfection of this kind. With the broader campaign moving at a pace that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, a single city maintaining resistance was an irritant that his temperament was poorly suited to accommodate. He wanted the resistance broken, and he wanted it broken quickly, a demand that was passed to the Luftwaffe with the directness that characterized his interventions in operational matters when his impatience had reached its limit. On May the 14th, the order was carried out. A massive air attack descended on Rotterdam in the afternoon. The aircraft came in carrying two 200-pound delayed action bombs. Load after load of them dropped into the dense residential and commercial fabric of the city's heart. The delayed action mechanism meant that the bombs penetrated buildings before detonating, maximizing structural collapse and spreading their destructive force through adjacent structures in ways that instantaneous detonation would not have achieved. Across an area covering 642 acres, the destruction was comprehensive, only a handful of structures emerging intact, among them the town hall, the stock exchange, and the post office, preserved more by chance than by any protective geometry. A margarine factory took a direct hit during the raid, its contents igniting and spreading burning fat across the surrounding blocks in a manner that accelerated and extended the fires already consuming the old quarters of the city. The fires, once established across that density of wooden construction and close-packed streets, became a secondary catastrophe layered over the primary one, moving through neighborhoods that the bombs had damaged but not yet destroyed, completing what the aircraft had begun. More than 25,000 houses were gutted entirely. Nearly 78,000 civilians lost their homes. Over 800 people died in the assault, and thousands more were wounded among the debris and the burning streets. The defenders of Rotterdam, confronted with this, capitulated. There was no coherent military logic that could weigh the continuation of resistance against what had just been done to the city behind the lines being held. Late on the evening of May the 14th, the Commander-in-Chief of the Dutch Armed Forces, still at his headquarters in The Hague, issued a general ceasefire order. In 5 days of fighting, the Netherlands had lost 2,100 soldiers killed and 2,700 wounded, and the city that had held longest now lay largely in ruins. The bombing produced one consequence that ran counter to German intentions. The following day, British bombers operating from bases in France turned their attention toward the industrial cities of Germany's Ruhr Valley, striking back at the economic and manufacturing infrastructure that sustained the German war effort. It was the beginning of something that would, over years, grow into a campaign of enormous destructive scale. On that May morning in 1940, it was a response, measured, deliberate, and freighted with meaning about what kind of war this had now become. The other consequence of Rotterdam was less tangible, but in the short term perhaps more immediately significant. Word of what had happened to the city spread westward through Belgium and France, with a speed and a distortion that atrocity reports tend to acquire as they travel. The numbers grew in the telling. The dead multiplied from hundreds into tens of thousands. The destruction of a large section of the city became, in the compressed and frightened imagination of a population already absorbing too much terrible news, the annihilation of the entire city. 35,000 dead, it was reported and believed. Rotterdam was gone. The effect on the civilian populations of Belgium and France, already unsettled by the speed of the German advance and the collapse of the front they had been assured could hold, was a wave of dread that translated directly into movement. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered what they could carry and took to the roads, moving away from the advancing front, driven by the specific fear that what had happened to Rotterdam could happen to wherever they currently stood. The roads of northern France and Belgium, already carrying military traffic that the campaign required to move with speed and precision, became clogged with this vast human tide, civilians and soldiers and vehicles all pressing through the same inadequate arteries, each slowing the others, the whole mass moving at the pace of the slowest cart and the most exhausted family. The fear of another Rotterdam entered the campaign as a force of its own, and it worked in its quiet and devastating way against every Allied attempt to move troops and supplies where the battle needed them. The morning of May the 15th arrived in Paris, carrying the particular weight of news that has travelled overnight and arrived without softening. At 7:30, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was awakened by a telephone call from Paul Reynaud, the French Premier, whose voice carried across the line with a quality that Churchill later described as conveying considerable stress. Reynaud did not build toward what he had to say. He said it directly, in the abrupt manner of a man who has been awake long enough with a truth that he can no longer hold back from the person who needs to hear it. "We have been defeated," he said. "We are beaten. The battle is lost." Churchill flew to Paris the following day, and what he found there exceeded what even Reynaud's words had prepared him to expect. The situation, he would later write, was incomparably worse than anything he had imagined from London. The sky above the Quai d'Orsay, the great building that housed the French Foreign Ministry, one of the architectural anchors of the city's sense of its own permanence, was wreathed in smoke. Officials were burning documents in the ministry's garden, feeding the accumulated paper of diplomatic years into fires that rose and dispersed into the spring air above the Seine. Projected agreements, carefully constructed arrangements, the written evidence of a decade's foreign policy, all of it returning, as one witness observed, to its most elemental form. The bureaucratic instinct for caution had sent copies of many of these documents southward by train, But that precaution proved futile. The Germans intercepted the train and recovered every page anyway. Inside the Quai d'Orsay, Churchill met with Reynard, the former Premier Édouard Daladier, and General Maurice Gamelin, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, the man whose signature was on every major operational decision of the campaign now visibly collapsing around them. Churchill listened to the account of the German breakthrough, the armoured rush through the Ardennes, the crossing of the Meuse, the corridor driving westward toward the sea. Then he turned to Gamelin with the question that every military commander is supposed to have a ready answer for. The question about the reserve force, the strategic mass held back from the line precisely for moments when the front has been breached and something must be thrown into the gap to seal it. Gamelin's response was a shrug. There was no reserve. Or rather, what reserves existed had been distributed loosely along the front, rather than concentrated into a force capable of decisive intervention. And so for the practical purpose Churchill's question addressed, the answer was the same as none. Gamelin was 68 years old. He had served France across decades of military life, and in the desperate autumn of 1914, as a younger officer, he had contributed to the planning that stopped the German advance at the Marne, the moment that saved Paris in an earlier war, and passed into French military memory as something close to sacred. Whether he was, in those days of May 1940, sustained by the hope of repeating something like that achievement, or simply overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening around him at a speed his habits of mind were not equipped to process, those who watched him could not be certain. What they could observe was the result. For 9 days from the opening of the German offensive, Gamelin appeared to those around him to have taken no decisive action himself. He had left the management of the battle to his subordinate, General Alphonse Georges, a man he had never fully trusted, and who was, in addition, in poor health. When Gamelin finally went to Georges' headquarters on May the 19th, he found an atmosphere that spoke for itself without requiring interpretation. Telephones rang and typewriters clattered in the performance of activity, but the officers moving through the rooms had the dispersed, exhausted quality of people going through motions that no longer connected to outcomes. The smell of stock toilets hung over everything. Georges himself was in a state of what Gamelin recognized as profound physical and moral depression. Gamelin withdrew and drafted a plan, a design for a coordinated attack in which the encircled forces in the north would drive southward through the German corridor, while French armies south of the Somme struck northward to meet them, cutting the panzer spearheads off and giving the Allies a chance to reconstitute a coherent front. Whether such a plan could have been executed by forces that were exhausted, fragmented, and increasingly short of ammunition, running in a war of movement where orders became obsolete overnight, remained deeply uncertain. It did not matter. Paul Reynaud had already concluded that the campaign required something other than the man who had been commanding it. Gamelin was replaced by General Maxime Weygand, another figure from the previous war, summoned as a symbol of the kind of unyielding resolve that France needed to believe was still available to it. Weygand arrived at his new command on the evening of May the 19th, a man of 73 whose mind and bearing remained, by all accounts, notably alert. The need of the hour, however, had passed beyond what alertness alone could address, and Weygand, for all the confidence that his name was meant to project, was hardly the man for it. De Gaulle's second counterattack ended as the first had, the French armour pressing forward, making contact, and then being turned back by forces that were better coordinated, better supplied, and operating with a momentum that French resistance, however determined, could not yet arrest. Guderian's advance headquarters came under real pressure during one of these engagements, his position protected by nothing more substantial than a handful of 20mm anti-aircraft guns, while French tanks penetrated to within a mile of his staff. For a stretch of uncomfortable hours, the architect of the breakthrough found himself in closer proximity to the fighting than any corps commander had reason to prefer. The French tanks eventually moved off. The advance resumed. What characterized the days that followed the Meuse crossing was a contest between two opposing instincts within the German command. The aggressive urge of the men at the front who could feel, in a way that maps at distant headquarters could not convey, the extent of the French army's disintegration, and the institutional caution of superiors who looked at those same maps and saw a long, exposed wedge being driven deeper and deeper into enemy territory with its flanks insufficiently protected. Guderian found his advance halted twice in the opening days of the breakthrough by orders from above. Commanders who wanted the infantry to close the distance with the tanks to establish the kind of continuous combined front that the previous war had taught them to regard as essential before further movement. The logic was not unreasonable in the abstract. In the specific reality of what was happening in the French rear, it was the wrong logic for the moment. Guderian understood this with a clarity born of proximity. He could see what his forward units were moving through, and he knew that hesitation was the one thing that might yet allow the French to recover enough coherence to form a new line. He argued, pressed, and in some instances quietly circumvented. He persuaded his superiors to amend their orders in terms that permitted him to continue what he described as consolidating the bridgehead, and then interpreted that permission with a latitude that his commanders might not have intended to extend. Miles of telephone wire were strung from his command post forward to his leading units, allowing him to issue attack orders without transmitting radio messages that nervous officers at higher headquarters might intercept and countermand. Hitler's anxiety during these days was, by the accounts of those around him, almost painful to observe. He had conceived and championed the plan that was now producing results of extraordinary magnitude, and yet the very scale of those results terrified him. The tanks were too far forward. The flanks were too exposed. The corridor was too long and too thin, and the infantry too far behind. He raved to his chief of the Army General Staff, General Franz Halder, that his commanders were throwing away the chance of a lifetime by pushing the armor beyond what could be safely sustained. It took many weary hours of patient argument before Halder, who had himself come to embrace the aggressive tempo that the situation demanded, could settle the Führer's fears enough to let the advance continue at its pace. Behind all of this, behind the arguments and the wire and the anxiety and the counterattacks, the tanks kept moving. Every available armored and motorized vehicle had been pressed into the corridor, and prodigies of organization were required each day simply to keep 71 German divisions, 10 of them armored, from locking themselves into a permanent and catastrophic traffic jam. Yet the machine held together, and the pace held, and the gap in the French line grew wider and deeper with each passing day. By the 16th of May, the breach in the French defensive front had reached 60 miles across, a rupture so vast that it ceased to resemble anything military doctrine had developed language for. Through that opening, armor and motorized infantry and motorcycle reconnaissance units came pouring westward across a landscape that was also carrying, in the opposite direction, tens of thousands of refugees in cars and carts and on foot, driven from their homes by the approach of something they could hear but in many cases not yet see. One observer described the sight of those columns with a plainness that carried its own gravity. People accelerating their vehicles, pushing handcarts, abandoning the relative shelter of individual houses to congregate in long processions on roads that drew enemy attention precisely because of their density. The instinct to flee toward others, to move rather than stay, was overwhelming and in its collective expression, deeply dangerous. Amiens fell. Abbeville followed. In 10 days, the armoured columns had covered ground that the armies of the previous war had spent 4 years failing to reach. And on the night of May the 20th, German armour arrived at the small French village of Noyelles-sur-Mer and found, beyond it, the grey expanse of the English Channel. The news travelled back through the chain of command to Hitler's headquarters, where General Alfred Jodl noted in his diary that the Führer received it in a state of barely contained exultation, beside himself with joy at what the morning had confirmed. The reach of what had been accomplished in those 10 days was not immediately visible in any single image or any single report. It emerged gradually as the full shape of the German advance became legible on maps that Allied commanders were struggling to read accurately even as the lines on them kept shifting. What those maps revealed, when their meaning finally came into focus, was a transformation of the strategic situation so complete that the word breakthrough no longer captured it. This was something of a different order entirely. In a single sustained operation, Germany had done what no military force had managed in the previous war across 4 years of devastating effort. The Allied plan for fighting the campaign had been rendered not merely ineffective but entirely obsolete. The armies that were supposed to be meeting the German advance along a coherent front were instead divided, split into 2 separate bodies by the corridor that Guderian's and Rommel's columns had driven all the way to the Channel coast. What had been one connected Allied force was now 2 disconnected ones, separated by 60 miles of German-held territory and unable to coordinate, reinforce or relieve each other across that gap. The consequences for the forces caught on the northern side of that corridor were severe in a way that compressed rapidly toward catastrophic. Pressed from the front by von Bock's Army Group B driving in from Belgium, and now threatened along their flank and rear by the armoured columns that had reached the sea behind them, the Allied armies in the north found themselves in a position that military terminology describes with a word whose full weight is easy to underestimate. They were being encircled. The numbers involved gave that word its gravity. The entire Belgian army was within the closing ring. Nearly all of the divisions of the British Expeditionary Force, the whole of Britain's committed land force on the continent, were caught in the same shrinking perimeter. 2 of the finest French armies, the formations that had advanced into Belgium with such confidence just days before, were now among those threatened with envelopment. In total, the force at risk numbered close to 1 million men, soldiers of 3 nations, equipped with their weapons and vehicles and supplies, facing the prospect of being compressed into a pocket from which there was no obvious military exit. The arithmetic of the situation admitted only one path that avoided complete destruction. If the encircled force could break out southward quickly enough and link up with the French armies still operating south of the Somme, a new front might yet be established. The corridor severed, the two halves of the Allied force reunited, the campaign given new terms on which it might be continued. It was a demanding operation to conceive of under the best conditions, under the conditions that actually prevailed in the last days of May, with units exhausted, supply lines disrupted, communications fragmented, and the German pressure unrelenting from multiple directions. It was a possibility that was growing more remote with each passing hour. What remained if the breakout failed was a grimmer geography. The northern coast of France and the southwestern coast of Belgium offered a handful of ports through which men and materiel could still move. Ostend and Nieuwpoort in Belgium, and along the French coast, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk. These ports had been, in the days before the German advance reached the sea, nothing more than logistical nodes, places through which supplies moved and reinforcements arrived. They had become something else now. As long as those ports remained in Allied hands, the encircled armies could still receive a degree of supply, still maintain some connection to the world beyond the closing ring. Through them, in the worst case, men could be taken off, moved back across the Channel to Britain, carrying with them whatever they could bring from the equipment and artillery and vehicles that weeks of fighting had assembled on French soil. It was a contingency that no one in Allied headquarters in those first days of encirclement wanted to contemplate openly, because to contemplate it was to acknowledge how far the situation had already travelled from anything that planning had anticipated. The Channel ports were the last door, and behind the advancing German columns, that door was narrowing. Weygand arrived at his new command and immediately set aside the plan that Gamlin had drafted in his final hours as Supreme Commander. He immersed himself in conferences with the Allied commanders in Belgium, moving through the chain of authority with the energy of a man determined to demonstrate that his appointment represented a genuine change in direction. 3 days passed in this manner. 3 days in which the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate at a pace that conferences could not slow. When Weygand finally produced his own operational plan, those who compared it to Gamlin's found it difficult to identify any meaningful difference between the two. The same broad concept, the same coordinated attack from north and south against the German corridor, the same hope that the encircled forces could drive through and link up with the armies below the Somme. What had changed in those 3 days was the condition of the armies that would have needed to execute it. Among the Allied commanders in the north, a quality had settled that resisted the ordinary military vocabulary of setback or difficulty. It was closer to a paralysis of will, a condition that spread through headquarters with the quiet devastation of something organic, touching officers who had trained for decades for exactly this kind of crisis and finding in them, when the crisis arrived at this scale and this speed, a capacity for decision that the situation had simply overwhelmed. A British liaison officer described a meeting with General René Bellotte, who held command over all the French, British and Belgian forces in the north, the entire body of troops now threatened with encirclement and destruction. Bellotte spread a map on the table and began counting the red circles marking the German armoured divisions arrayed against him, working through the numbers methodically, all the way to 8. Against all of them, he kept repeating in a monotone, he could do nothing. He was dead tired. Against all of them, nothing. Blot was killed in an automobile accident on the 21st of May and was succeeded by General Jean-Georges Maurice Blanchard, who had commanded the French First Army. The transition in command consumed time and attention that the campaign could not spare, and Blanchard inherited a situation that had worsened materially in the hours it took to arrange the handover. The historian Marc Bloch, who served as a headquarters officer under Blanchard during these days, described what he witnessed with the precision of a man whose professional life had been devoted to understanding how events acquire their shape. Blanchard stood before his maps in what Bloch called tragic immobility, saying nothing, doing nothing, gazing at the colored lines and symbols as though somewhere in their geometry a decision might surface that he was otherwise unable to reach. A British counterattack had been mounted near Arras in the days before, designed to reinforce the city and cut into the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division as it drove northward. General Lord Gort had committed 2 divisions and 74 tanks to the effort, supported by 60 tanks from the French 3rd Light Mechanized Division. A parallel French attack further east had been planned to complement it, but failed to materialize due to the breakdown in communications that had become a defining feature of Allied operations in those days. The attack that did go forward struck the Germans with enough force to throw a crack SS motorized division into serious disorder and send an alarm through Rommel's headquarters that the scale of the assault had been greatly magnified in the reporting. For a short time it seemed as though something might yet give. Rommel steadied his lines with artillery and anti-tank guns, then brought his armor forward to break the assault. The Allied attack was stopped with a loss of more than 40 tanks. The Germans lost barely a dozen. Fighting around Arras continued for several days, but the main German advance went on unchecked, and with each passing day the window for any meaningful breakout from the north grew narrower. On the 28th of May, after 18 days of fighting that had torn his small determined forces to pieces across every sector they had been asked to hold, King Leopold of Belgium, acting in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Belgian Armed Forces rather than as a sovereign, surrendered to the Germans. The capitulation removed from the Allied order of battle the entire Belgian army, closing off another section of the line and pushing the perimeter of the encirclement tighter around the forces that remained. Weygand, by this point, had privately concluded that the war was lost. The conclusion did not prevent him from issuing communiques that bore no relationship to the situation they described, documents of misplaced optimism that misinformed his own generals about how dire things had become. On the 26th of May, with the northern armies coming apart, he telegraphed Gort and Blanchard urging them to attack southward with the confidence and energy of a tiger, assuring them that a French advance from the south was in very good shape. There was no such advance. There could not have been. In Paris, in the corridors of government buildings, and in quieter conversations held between people who had been watching the campaign with clear eyes, something was shifting in the language that the war was being discussed in. It arrived first as a whisper, a word spoken carefully, in private, by people who understood its weight and its danger, and said it anyway because the facts were accumulating beyond the point where other words remained adequate. Within days, it was being said aloud by influential voices in rooms where such a word would have been met with outrage and accusations of treason only a week before. The word was surrender.